Okay, welcome back. So in this video, again, we're going to just keep marching through our Power Automate deep overview. Again, this is part of the series of the Power Platform, all the different technologies in the Power Platform, why it should matter, how organizations can take advantage of this compared to some of the traditional methods and processes and ways that we would use to solve for these problems. In the last video, we talked about, is Power Automate really good for pro developers, or how can a pro developer find their way or find their space, leveraging their experience and skill set and applying to the Power Automate? In this video, we're going to actually talk about batch jobs. Now, that's another capability or characteristics of Power Automate, is the fact that you can use it like a batch job, like where you have a scheduler and all this other good stuff. So let's kind of go over here and find some space in the whiteboard. This is kind of getting pretty, we're doing a good job. We're filling up our whiteboard and we have to find some space. So let's kind of talk about the traditional ways, especially from a SharePoint developer or even a .NET developer, any developer in the Microsoft ecosystem. How we would solve for batch jobs in the past. So in the past, we would, especially as a SharePoint developer, we would use like timer jobs. Timer jobs is that, you have that one area in the farm administration where all the timer jobs ran. It kind of give you one, you can set the schedule, then you can kind of see the history of that timer job. So timer jobs is one of those things, and those are kind of finicky to set up, right? Because you had like an on-prem, you still had an on-prem footprint, but the schedule piece was kind of stored and managed inside of SharePoint. Then you had the console jobs. This is what the .NET developer or the traditional .NET developer would kind of gravitate towards. That's one of the projects in the .NET solution that you can create. Just create a console app. That console model has more the dependency injection pattern, right? One, you had to find the infrastructure to run it on. So most of the time that console is going to run on another server that was used for another purpose or intent. And this was kind of like, oh, we have some extra room. You can run your console job here. The issue with that is maintain the server. Who's responsible for keeping the server updated and patching? So you had infrastructure requirements that you had to attend to. The other pieces, more, centric to your console job was the logging in disk space. Usually disk space is probably the number one thing that you had to feed and care for over time, right? Because you're creating these logs, and if you didn't have a really good purging mechanism to get rid of those logs, it would just stack up on the disk, and then you would, eventually run out of disk space. So, and then things would break, and then you have to analyze and understand why things are breaking, why that process or job didn't run, so on and so forth. So a lot of that gets, I'm going to say eliminated, but, one, the infrastructure piece, we're pushing off to Microsoft. That's just the beauty of 365 tenant in general. So the infrastructure piece we push off. As far as the logging, Power Automate will log for you, right? There's actually nothing that you have to do to set that up. Logging is going to be done for you by default. Logging in a sense, this is the time the job ran, if it ran successful, if it failed. If it failed, you can actually click on that instance and then trace and see where in the process it failed. And there's usually like an error message that will hopefully leave clues on why it didn't process. So understanding that and I think that's what, and two, okay, most important piece, one, infrastructure is taken care of for you. Logging is taken care of for you. It's actually by default. And of course, you can add other things to that. You can create your own login within the system. But lastly, all of this is done in the browser, right? So there's nothing to download on your local machine. There's nothing to install. There's no tool to install, or, you have to request administrate local admin access to install something. All of this is going to be done right here in the browser. It's really a breath of fresh air. And I think with the browser technology today, there's so much that you can do in the browser. Let's look at some of the patterns or processes, or maybe some of the ideas that you would use as a batch process within Power Automate. Now, one of those would be processing the queue. And what do we mean by that? So basically, in the site provision, this is one of those things that you can do. You can have, I showed you yesterday where we kind of like filled out that form, and then based on that user, filling out that site request form, it kind of dropped into a SharePoint list. Now, you can process this list in real time, or you can queue these requests up and have them processed at a designated time. And usually the queue is usually something that's, and this probably not be a great example for a queue pattern, but usually queues are, it's process intensive. You want to take that process and do it off hours where it's not impacting your day-to-day, and you have resources available for your day-to-day internet systems, applications, or whatever the case may be. Most of the time, especially here in the cloud, you can usually process real time. But again, it's really just your business scenario, your use case. And if you're changing data on, through a batch process, maybe you want to continue to have that as a nightly run, even though it may not impact the infrastructure. So that's the reason for a queue. But here I got a site request. They dropped your request in the queue. And what I would do is create a Power Automate that will read from this queue on a nightly schedule. And then we will process each one of these items that are in the queue that needs to be processed. Now, at the end of processing, what we would do is say, for example, if that is a site provisioning, at the end of the process, we will either update that item in the SharePoint list, which is one of the things I like, because then you have historics and say, yep, this process, this didn't. The other thing I love about keeping it in the list versus removing the item, which is another option you have, is that you can change the status of it to force it to rerun or re-execute the next time the job runs. So I'm a really big fan of leaving these items there, updating the status, and then maybe have an archive or a purge process that would get rid of the aged items after so many days or whatever the case may be. The other one, another instance of this would be imagine that you have an onboarding application. Again, this is my Power Apps for onboarding, right? And they would put in the new employee's name, the address, and maybe the email that's needed, basic information about the new associate. And then what we would do is kind of drop that into a list. Now, from that list, actually for this one, we're going to do a trigger, and that's going to trigger a Power Automate. And that's going to notify someone on the help desk or in the IT team to go ahead and create an AD account for that user. Now, once that AD account is done, then what the engineer would do is just update this item and say, yep, the account is done. And then they update the status as such. And now what I would do off hours is create a Power Automate batch job. Right? This is my Power Automate batch job. And basically what that batch job is going to do is take that user based on their department and then drop them into the Azure AD groups needed based on that particular department and the role of that user. So that user could be part of marketing. I'm going to drop them into all the marketing Azure AD groups, but they also may be a manager. So that may be an additional 2 or 3 groups that only managers are part of. And what this batch job would do is that once that's processed, email the hiring manager that this user set up and they're ready to go. And again, so as you can see, batch jobs can also be intermixed with a manual process where the Power Automate trigger will send an email notification to the engineer, and then the engineer will act and do their piece, the manual piece, and then set the status. And then on a nightly basis, this batch job will run and then apply and drop them into the various security groups. So again, these are just examples of how you can use this. Another one is that, you can have a batch job do something that's not part of a list, right? So here, imagine that you have Microsoft Teams sites or Microsoft Teams, not necessarily sites, right? And within this Microsoft Teams, you have let's just do this. You have your team, right? And we all know the structure for Teams. And then within the team, you have your various channels, right? So what we do normally, what you would see some organizations do, they will create a team per project, right? And as you can see, that can grow horizontally very quickly. And, especially if you're doing like 50, just say you're doing on the average, your organization on the average is doing about 20 projects a month, right? So over time, you can see that could be 240 teams that's just floating out there. Now, what the project manager would do is, once that project has kind of completed and they close that project down, they will submit a ticket that says this project is done, or that would be part of their project completion process to kind of close the project, or someone in the PMO would kind of close the project. And then what we would do is create a Power Automate batch job that will actually go through and scan all of the teams that are in Microsoft Teams, finding the ones that are flagged as archived or completed, and extract the files from the various channels within that team, archive those into a project archive site collection. But the key is that this batch job is responsible for archiving the site. And this just keeps your Microsoft Teams fresh. It keeps it up to date. Anything that's archived or anything that's no longer needed gets archived and pushed away. We won't delete it, right? And you may tag retention schedules and different labels and other compliance pieces that you may need to tie to this. The idea is which batch jobs, and this is actually more common than not, is you have teams. You have a team, not Microsoft team, but a team, a group of people where they're storing their documents in the document library. And I'm gonna pick on, let's just say, legal and compliance. So they're storing like all these documents, all these policies and procedures. One of the core regulatory requirements for this department is that they have to show the auditors that they are reviewing these documents annually or on some type of periodic schedule of making sure that they're up to date. And if there's any revisions or changes needed to match, the new processes and the new way of working at the organization, these standard operating procedures or policies and procedures are updated to reflect that. So most of this in this library can grow to hundreds and hundreds of documents. So basically what happened is that for this document, we will create metadata in that document library for this particular library. And one of the metadata columns would be the review date. And based on that review date, you guessed it, there is a Power Automate batch job that gets executed on a nightly basis. Even though you're only updating this annually, any one of these documents can fall on any day throughout that year, right? So it's not a job that you run once a year. You may actually run it daily to scan the library to see what needs to be updated. You don't want to get reminded the day the revision is needed, right? You want to get reminded 60 days prior. And then if you're not act on it, within that 60 days and 30 days to that deadline or 5 days to that deadline. And then you can even build in escalation. Okay, you're on the 5th day. You only have 5 days to complete this revision based on regulatory requirement. I'm going to actually send you a reminder, but also escalate this to not only your manager, but the risk manager of the entire organization, just so that this thing gets the right visibility and the right pressure and priority applied to that. So that email notification can CC a group, right, just to make sure that things get caught. And then obviously, there's an escalation piece to where I'm sending a reminder on the 60th day prior to the review date, 30 days prior to the review date, 5 days with escalation, right? And then just to make sure this thing has the right visibility. All right, let's talk about the other option. The other option would be for batch jobs. It could be integration. And I'm gonna talk through integration more in depth in the next video. I think that's the one that's coming up tomorrow. But integration in the sense of you have data, right? If you have any great data strategy, you always try to establish a single source of truth for a domain of data, right? So imagine this is client data. You want this to come and always be sourced from, updated, and created inside of Salesforce, right? But over here in the Microsoft tenant, you're going to have the Power Platform, and this could be a Power App. This could actually be a mobile app, to where they're filling out information to, let's just say, request a presentation for a particular client, right? So here I have my Power App form, and here I have my SharePoint list, and then here I have my Power Automate, and that's going to notify someone in this sales department. What I'm gonna do is have someone, all my reps, right? And this is why this may be a Power App mobile app. I have my reps who are out in the field. They met with a client, and the client says, "Yep, I'm very interested in that new product or service that your organization just came out with," right? So you kind of sell them on that. So, but there's a team dedicated to that new product or service, and that team needs to go out and do a presentation. So basically what you want to do is submit this information, filling out this form, have that saved in a SharePoint list. From that SharePoint list, that would trigger your Power Automate. The Power Automate would then send a notification to this team, and that team will go out and meet the client. The issue, and this is where the Power Automate batch job comes in, The issue that we normally run into is filling out this form is 90% of that information is stored here in Salesforce. So we don't want our reps to have to double key that or type in the wrong information, or there may be a primary record key or some type of number that you need associated with that. So that way, through your analytics and your metrics and your dashboards, so all this information is stored in Salesforce. Now, I need them to be able to pre-populate that. All the details needed for that client is defaulted in that form. Anything that they need to override or contact information, email, whatever, that gets submitted. And then that, that client data and that information gets stored within the SharePoint list. So the biggest question is going to be, how do you get this Salesforce client data into this Power Apps? Now, there's two reasons why you want to do what I'm about to show you. The first reason is absolutely there's a connector in Power Apps that when you load that Power App, it will make the Salesforce data available to the user. The problem with that connector, and I'm going to say the problem, but one of the things you should be aware of with that particular connector is that connector is a premium connector. And usually that's the case. Usually when you're trying to connect to something that is outside of the Microsoft ecosystem, they make that available to you, but best believe there's going to be a premium attached to that availability. So what we would do as a developer, we will create a Power Automate, create this Power Automate batch job, and basically what it would do is query client information from Salesforce and then dump a copy of that information inside of a SharePoint list, right? So this is going to be client data, and this sync process is going to be one way. We still want to maintain Salesforce as the source of truth. There's a lot of goodness that Salesforce does at an enterprise solution or as an enterprise platform that we do not want to replicate. We just want the data. Once we do that, once you get a copy of the Salesforce data through your batch job Power Automate and store it on the SharePoint list, this scenario here, let me kind of zoom in a little bit. This scenario here with your Power App becomes really, really trivial. Again, this is one of those things where you start to get very creative with your solution architecture to create these solutions that are feasible and cost efficient for the organization, and you're not requiring a lot of cost or overhead, but you're still allowing the convenience of filling out these apps and these forms using the mobile or using the desktop form or whatever the case may be. And you're grabbing data that's stored in Salesforce, but it's a one-way sync. We're only grabbing a subset of that data, and it's going to be read only. And so that way we're not creating fragments of data across the organization. We're still sourcing that from Salesforce. And so we keep that data integrity, and we stay within the data framework or the data governance within the organization by pulling the subset. What else can you do with this? Oh, here's one. Actually, let me show you a couple of these in practice. Here's one I did not cover on the whiteboard, but this is a governance batch process, right? So this is a governance process that runs every 30 minutes. Actually, probably run every 2 hours, actually, sorry. But it runs every 2 hours, and as an administrator, or the service account that I'm using is going to be the administrator for all the flows created within the organization. And what it's going to do is going to determine for the flow that's created, the one that's on, that's active, because you can turn flows on or off, but the ones that are on, make sure that the creator of that flow is an authorized app maker. And when I say authorized app maker, that may be a scenario where you're doing your Power App governance and your Power App adoption framework. Part of that is to make sure that people who are using these tools, who are using the Power Apps and Power Automate and Power BI, are actually being trained or receive some type of training to use them. So that way we don't put all of this power in the hands of someone who really don't understand what they're doing, who really don't understand the governance, the data governance piece behind it, and the responsibility that comes with being an app maker. You build it, you own it, and you're responsible for the support of it, of the application. You're not going to dump that onto IT you're not going to dump that onto the help desk. To be an authorized user, there may be, again, a SharePoint list of all the authorized users, probably the date that they had their training. You probably want them to be retrained with the latest tooling and capabilities of Power Apps, so on and so forth. But that's what this flow does, right? So again, this is an example of how you can use the flow to help with the governance, even governance within the Power Apps. Now, isn't that funny, right? Or the Power Platform, because now you're using the Power Platform to govern the Power Platform, which is a beautiful thing. Now, what's this one? Here's the situation. Oh, here's the reminder. The reminder, again, this first trigger is just a schedule. These schedules are very, very flexible to where you can, do these intervals. You can go very aggressive, like once every minute. These will not fire every minute. I think the most latency I've seen, that a time that you probably want to put between these is probably 7 minutes or 5 to 7 minutes, just because they would just start to stack up on top of each other. Another thing and we kind of run through this with console apps, is that, say for example, a console or a batch job may take, depending on what it is, it may take 2 hours to process, and your schedule is executing this every 30 minutes. Well, you're just running jobs 24/7, because the job never stops. Like before the first one even finished, you're running another job right behind or overlapping that. So this thing is just wasting resources and killing resources. So there's a setting to get around that, where you can say concurrency control. If you turn this on, it will actually queue them up. If it says, yeah, I know you're scheduled to run every 30 minutes, but since this job has been created 5 years ago, it actually, initially there's no data, so it probably runs like a champ, within 5 to 10 minutes. But because the data has grown over time, now this job, what used to run and execute in 10 minutes, is now taking 2-3 hours to execute, because of the amount of data and the steps needed. So here you can throw in this concurrency control to where you can turn this all the way down to 1. And basically it says only one job can execute, can be running at a time. I'm gonna still trigger these other jobs based on their schedule, but I'm gonna queue them up. So as soon as that one finishes, the other one will start. As soon as that one finishes, the other one will start. And that would just allow you to have more control. So that's a capability that you have. And then here I just grab the data for that particular file, and then basically loop through all of the contracts and try to see, who expires what, and collect that data, right? And once I have that, there's a certain email that I will send the ones that are expired, that are set to be reviewed within the next 10 days versus the ones that are set to be reviewed within the next 30 days. As I mentioned before, you can put in an escalation process. Hopefully this sheds some light on how you can use batch jobs within Power Automate. Extremely, extremely powerful. I mean, it's really up to your imagination and up to your creativity on what you want to do with these. Again, these are Lego blocks. So to learn, some of this comes with time, is just experience, right? Or being coupled with someone with experience. But also it's really understanding the connectors and the capabilities of those connectors. You have to jump in there and practice. So by now you should have a developer's tenant, and this is something that we talked through, I think, in video 1 and video 2 of this series. And you're jumping in here, you're practicing. I kind of gave you some ideas on things that you can do. Try the reminder batch job, right? Set up a batch job against the document library. That will simplify this part of it, of the process. But jump in there and get going. I mean, just try it out, kick the tires on it, and kind of start to get fluent in these. Okay, what are we going to talk about tomorrow? So tomorrow, we're going to go a little bit deep dive on integration. And it could be integration against enterprise applications like Salesforce, ServiceNow, Workday, wherever the case may be, as well as custom applications that may still live on your on-prem environment. And that's what we'll cover tomorrow. So until then, I'll see you tomorrow.